Everyone. My name is Elizabeth Fitzsimons, Vice President of Leadership and Engagement at LEAD San Diego, an affiliate of the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to our webinar series, Leading in a New Reality. At LEAD San Diego, we're focused on connecting, educating, and empowering leaders for positive change. And this series is produced in partnership with Jones, a company whose mission is to develop leaders and human systems that counter oppression through diversity, inclusion, and organizational effectiveness. We launched this webinar at the start of the pandemic to help leaders of teams and leaders of families adapt to the new challenges of working remotely and parenting and distance learning. After George Floyd was killed by police and there were the calls for reform to policing and racist systems, we pivoted to provide space for understanding, learning, and connection and action. You can find those webinars on the LEAD YouTube channel. Today we're talking about our kids, and whether you're a parent, grandparent, aunt, uncle, or mentor to small kids or teens, this is for you. Conversations about racism and what it means to be anti-racist are talks that need to be going on right now. Our two guests will help us navigate those conversations and give us tools to help children's growing minds process what is happening. And we really want you to leave this webinar today feeling empowered and having some actionable steps to take. Before we get started, I want to let you know this webinar is being recorded, and we'll email the link after the program so you can view it later on and share it with your network. Also, this program is being live streamed by ABC 10 News, a longtime partner of LEAD San Diego. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to send us questions for our guests, and we'll take questions from our viewers on Facebook as well. My colleague and program manager, Kim Wynn, is at the controls, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. It's my pleasure to introduce our guests now. Chida Rebecca is the editor-in-chief of Black And Magazine, which is a premier digital Black lifestyle publication. She also provides media and marketing consultation through her business, Rebecca and Company. Prior to launching her business, Chida functioned as the co-publisher and managing editor of the San Diego Voice and Viewpoint newspaper, a family business that serves as the city's oldest and largest African-American publication, now in its 60th year. Before stepping into that role, Chida spent her time learning the family's businesses, which included operating San Diego's first Black Chamber of Commerce, created by her mother in 1990. At 22 years old, she was the organization's executive director. During that time, she created outlets and forums where economic issues affecting San Diego's Black businesses could be addressed. Welcome, Chida Rebecca.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
And Aisha Taylor is principal consultant with our partner, Jones. Dr. Taylor blends organizational psychology, leadership, cultural competency, psychometrics, women's empowerment, and spirituality to provide a unique style of consulting, coaching, and training. She holds a Ph.D. in industrial organizational psychology, and her research focuses on leadership, diversity, inclusion, and innovation. She also led a national nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C., working for women's full equality within the Catholic Church. Welcome, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Thank you all for being with us today. Chida, if we could start with you. Recently, you had a very powerful op-ed in the San Diego Union Tribune, and we'll add a link to the chat for those who are watching who haven't yet read it. In it, you described some scenes from your childhood, starting when you were a little girl of 6 years old, age 6. Can you please share some of those examples you shared in your essay and tell us how those experiences impacted your parenting?
Well, thank you for referencing that first. In the opening of that op-ed, I described an instance of being 6 and having newly moved to Bonita, California, and anxiously looking for friends, and noticing that my demographics had shifted a little bit. I was in Southeast San Diego. The kids were predominantly African American, and now I'm in Bonita, and I didn't see any children that looked like me. And so I remember sitting in the lawn one day, waiting for some friends to come by, and a group of white boys came by on a bike. With one of them had their father with them, and I was waving and excited to see them and said hi. And one yelled out, "Hey, you black bee." And I just remember freezing, like, oh my God, I knew something wrong had just happened. So that was one instance of just kind of trying to figure out why, like, why was this happening to me? Other instances were, going to school, I went to predominantly white schools up until probably fourth or fifth grade, but me having this Rudy Huxtable hair, cotton like almost, and the children not understanding why my hair was like that, because I was usually the only one in the class with that kind of hair, or being referenced, saying my skin looked like the color of boo boo. And so I remember experiencing those things, and they just kind of stuck with me. Gratefully, my parents were able to navigate that. But as a parent, I recognize that we are not able to shield our children from such horrible experiences. And so I just always purpose to remember what it felt like to be a child and what those feelings were like for me. And knew I'd be a parent one day, but just said, wow, I want to remember this. Like, how do I deal with this? And how do I foster my children in that moment? So it's helped me be more connected to my kids and recognizing they're going to be exposed to some things.
So when those instances come up with your children, tell us about how you respond to them and help them.
Thankfully, my children have not encountered any such instances. I have been very open with them. My boys are 10 and 12, talking to them about racism and getting along with other children and sharing things that happened to me in my childhood, but not trying to plant too much of a seed in their minds so that they were walking around guarded, because I felt like me saying too much could kind of steal some things from them. So I'm thankful they haven't had those instances. Most of the things that they've become aware of have been through the news or, seeing things out in public and asking questions that way.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Taylor, as part of the Jones team, I know that Jones has been doing listening sessions across the country with a lot of different organizations, and you shared with me that in total 10,000 people have joined those sessions. What were some of the recurring themes that came up having to do with children?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, and thank you, Chida, for sharing that and for writing your powerful op-ed.
Thank you.
It shows what people, the types of and levels of emotion that people are dealing with, and that was definitely one of the biggest things that came out of those listening sessions, right? So, to give a frame to that, I just want to let you know that in those listening sessions, what we asked employees to do is to, take a moment to process and think about their emotions and stay in that heart space, because it's that figurative heart space, right? We know our emotions are all in our brain. But that it's easy to go to the head. It's easy to get cognitive and think, what can I read? What can I learn? What can I do with my head? What can I learn? Or it's easy to go to our feet and go sometimes, right? Not always, and not for everyone, but to go do something, to go to a vigil or go to a protest. But it can often be really hard, especially for white people in this work. And I'll claim my own experience. In the beginning of my journey in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, that was really hard for me to stay in the emotion of it. And instead of wondering about anger, I put up self-defensive walls and said, oh, well, I don't want this anger to be directed at me, until I started hearing the experiences, try to some of what you're talking about, right? This emotion, this different experience that Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color in the US are experiencing. So in terms of themes, the biggest theme was just this wide range of emotion, everything from sadness and grief and trauma on top of trauma to outrage and anger and why is this still happening, to hope and optimism and cautious optimism, right? Like maybe this time it's different, because it seems like a lot of people are standing up all over the world. I think the last count I heard, it was like 2,000 cities in the United States, mostly white suburbs, all the way to, New York and Chicago and Portland, right? So that the emotion of it, and that tied to children, is so important, right? Because my sons are almost 2 and 4, so I'm at the very beginning of this parenting process, especially in talking with my children about race. But we have started, and I'm excited to talk to you more about that. But the kids have such big emotion, right? And so they're picking up on it from their parents, from other adults that they're around. So that's a really important thing I just want to make sure that we're aware of as we are feeling drained and disappointed and outraged and pained. Our children are picking up on that, right? And feeling that too in a big way. Another thing, a huge theme that came out in terms of children is that parents, especially white parents, are just very uncomfortable with having the conversation around race. They're afraid to talk about it at work. They don't want to get fired or offend people or just say the wrong thing. They want to stand up because, we've been hearing a lot, silence is violence or silence is compliance. And so the kind of dichotomy of needing to stand up and say something, but not knowing what to say or how to say it. And that relates to white parents and conversations with their kids. So I appreciate so much this time, Elizabeth, to talk about this. Lots of feelings around anxiety and being ashamed for whiteness, right? And then I want to share just two themes that kids have been saying, or that the parents have been sharing, the kids have been saying. One is around injustice, right? Just seeing the injustice, and a 7-year-old asking her mom, why didn't that officer take his knee off of that man's neck? I don't understand. Why is this happening? And why did no one do anything about it? There were people around. This is what, so just the kids naming the injustice of it. And then secondly, a theme of safety. Parents sharing with us that their kids don't feel safe in places they used to feel safe, especially, of course, children of color, Black children in particular, right? That not safe to go on a run. I thought that was safe, but thinking about Ahmaud Arbery's story, or at school, right? We're hearing stories of parents who experienced being called, African-American parents who experienced being called Blackie every single day in their school, in their elementary school, and hoping it would be different for their kids, and it's not, right? Their kids are experiencing the same thing. And so the safety connected to the racial abuse or microaggressions, either way, we can use either of those terms, but kids are picking up on this, right? So of course, safety around the feeling unsafe around police, but it's also even at school and places where we thought we should be safe.
So it sounds like it's creating more of it's forcing some conversations, especially among the white families. And I want to ask Chida about how George Floyd's murder and the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement has affected the conversations that Black families are having with their children.
Well, I think personally, it's gone from, you guys, this is a story of Emmett Till and something that happened years ago to a modern day issue. And I mean, it's been happening, it's just more public now. It's never stopped. So when I have had to have those conversations, there were times where I would reference historical moments, but I was just telling a girlfriend of mine the other day, we were talking about it, and I said, gosh, we used to say, I'm glad I wasn't born back then. I'm glad I didn't live back then. And now we're living in back then. And so that realization for African Americans, it's just, it's tiring, but it really hasn't changed the conversation. It's just a continuation of it. We catch no break, if you will.
Well, the other day when we were talking, we were saying how just the frequency of these instances, right, or incidents where an unarmed Black man is killed by police, or an unarmed Black woman, and that it's happening. There's no time in between, and so you're thinking, like, how do I manage my child's well-being around this? Is it too much to be talking about? Can you share kind of your concerns there?
Yeah. One thing I do remember saying was that I think we, as parents, we have a responsibility to protect that innocence in our children, and the realization that children are children for a short period of time. They're going to be adults forever, but it's amazing how that short time in your life impacts the rest of your life. So my children live with my ex-husband right now, and I was asking him, like, hey, are you talking to the boys? But he's had to create safe spaces for them where they're not inundated. He's almost creating a shield, if you will. So he's aware, first it's a pandemic, the kids are uprooted out of school, they can't see their friends, and then it's this, and it's just like, what's going on? Mm-hmm. So we have a responsibility to protect them, and slowly kind of trickle the information to them, because it's difficult to have this conversation, but I think the parents are the shields. We have to stay aware of what's happening in society, and our kids are behind us, if you will, and then we can kind of spoon feed things to them as we're going through this journey. But I feel our first priority is to really protect them.
And how do you know? I think that something that has come up quite frequently is when to start these conversations. How do you know when your child is ready, and how do you approach that?
Yeah. Um, for me, I had to kind of watch my children. I think one thing I mentioned was that parents definitely have to have a good relationship with their children, one that's has strong communication. And my sons were in a dual immersion program, so they were the minority in the sense that the classrooms are predominantly Latino. And I remember asking my son when he was my youngest, when he was about 5 or 6, like I said, "What color are you?" And he said, "I'm an orangish color." And I said, "Okay, he's not ready. He thinks he's orange. He doesn't even see color, you know." And I left it there. I didn't even say anything. But in terms of our Black history and awareness in terms of what we have been through as a people, my kids started learning when they were 2, you know. But when they were in bigger settings with other children, I didn't force it. I just kind of watched them. I watched their interaction. My oldest son, because he was in dual immersion, he started picking up a Spanish accent. So I wonder often, did he think he was probably mixed? You know, he had a strong Spanish speaking accent, and took a strong liking to soccer. Most of his friends were Latino. And so that wasn't something I wanted to bring in the race conversation. Like, it wasn't important at the time. He was okay. Like, there was going to be time enough to talk about it in other spaces. So I think you have to study your children, look at their environments, because if you introduce it at the wrong time, I feel like you can kind of taint their thinking, and it can have an adverse effect. You might get something else that you weren't ready to deal with if you're not studying them and having conversations. And when it comes out, you want it to be natural. It shouldn't be a forced conversation like, "Hey, we're going to talk about racism today." Like, where's this coming from? Ask questions about their peers, and do you notice any differences? Just see where they're at, and maybe they've overheard things. If you talk to them often, kids will absolutely tell you what they've been hearing. And if they say something, a lot of times you'll find a way to interject that right comment, like, "Oh, you overheard that today? Well, how'd you feel about that? What do you think about that?" And then maybe go into the bigger conversation. But each kid is different, so they're very different. Some are like little adults.
Dr. Taylor, what are your thoughts on how to engage your children on these topics?
Absolutely. Yeah. And Chida, I so appreciate your comment around listening to them, right? We've got to listen and watch for their signals, and what might be too much, and where can we move forward on, and how it's not like a cookie cutter solution for each child, right? Like, how do
Yeah.
I need to be different with my 2-year-old and my 4-year-old, not just because of their ages, but because of their personalities and
Mhm.
their dispositions, right? And some are
Mhm.
more empathetic or sensitive than others, right? And right next to that, I also want to say that some things that I hear from my clients a lot of times from my white parents, we work with a lot of K through 12 schools, is from white parents, right? How long can I wait? How long can I wait to keep the innocence of my child safe and guarded and protected, really, which is understandable. And then often from parents of color, we hear, well, how early can I talk about race? How early can I start preparing them for what they may encounter in their elementary school classes, right? So one of the things, and I have a few resources I want to provide, but I was recently listening to this podcast where the woman spoke about, like, we need to tell kids the truth, right? And kids are complex. They're 3D characters, right? Like, they're not just, and I know this from my 4-year-old, even my 2-year-old, right? Like, they're not just innocent little being, like, they are messy and complex, and it's that false dichotomy, I think, sometimes that we create as adults, right? Like, adults are messy and complex, and kids are sweet and innocent, and they are, like, oh my gosh, kid hugs are the best. And at the same time, right, there's a complexity there. And so telling them the truth is important, because what the research is showing is that babies notice race and show signs of racial bias as early as 6 months old, right? And what we know from a lot of the unconscious bias research, and there's a ton of it out there, is that we start getting programmed with our biases from the day we were born, right? Everything that comes in, babies are a sponge, they just take it in. And what the research shows is that, what we say at Jones is, if you have a brain, you have bias. And so this bias forms so early. So for me in particular, and I'm at the, like I said, again, at the very beginning of this as a parent with a 2 and 4-year-old, but it has been important for me to talk about this early on. And how I've done it is, a friend recently got us a map of the world, and we have that on our in our dining room wall. for now. And I say, Grandma Bonnie, which is my mom, she is from Ireland and Scotland, and we point out Ireland and Scotland. But her family moved to the United States up in Northern California, a beautiful coastal town named Eureka, many, many years ago, and we've been there for many years, right? About 3 or 4 generations. And then I say on Daddy, and then my dad, Papa Dave, his family is originally from Germany and England. And they came over and settled in Kansas and then moved over to, we're following the map, right? And so that from Mommy, you are these, Irish, German, English, American. And then from Daddy's side, Grandma Nancy her mom came from the Ukraine. And Papa Brian came from the Chiricahua Apache Reservation in Kansas. And so our kids are biracial. And at the same time, very light-skinned, right? And so one quick example and I love this example because I feel like it shows comfortability in talking about race in Indigenous communities. So my husband, being Apache, he was doing some work on the reservation, San Carlos Apache Reservation in Arizona. We lived in Tucson at the time. So he drove out there and he took my 4-year-old. And he was a baby at the time, right? Very young. And he had very blonde hair, bright blue eyes. And so when Adam walked in with Micah, one of the women said, "Oh, a white baby," and she said it as a surprise, not as a judgment, not as anything, but she was comfortable enough to talk about race, to say it in front of a group of folks. And it wasn't a big deal. It was just an observation, right? And contrast that to a story that Robin DiAngelo talks about in her book, White Fragility, where, a white woman and her white child are in the grocery store and the white child says, "Oh, that man has black skin," out loud enough so that the man turns around, other people turn around. And what does the mom do? She goes, "Shh." Right. And the underlying message be, don't talk about race. That's not okay. There's something that's not okay about his skin being black that we need to not talk about it. Right. And that's the opposite of what we do. We do not want to do that. We want to talk about race and what it is, So maybe the mother could have said, "Oh yeah, that's great. That means he has more melanin in his skin, right? And you have less melanin in your skin, so your skin is white." And hopefully this is what I'm trying to do with my kids, right? We have that conversation before that happens in the grocery store. And so, we talk about Papa Brian's skin having more melanin, and that to bring in the racism piece, and that sometimes he gets treated differently because of that. And that's not very fair, is it? Mm-hmm. Right. And so using concrete, simple terms like fairness, especially for 4, 5, 6-year-olds, has been working for us. I've been looking at the research, and that's also what it's saying to do. And so I think that, and then another quick example I want to share, Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, she shared this in a podcast recently. And she said that her and her son, when he was younger, they were cooking breakfast, and she had just a few white eggs left, and also pulled out a package of brown eggs. And so she pulled out some white eggs and brown eggs, and her son noticed the difference in color of the eggs. And she said, "That's right. Yeah, but check this out. We had different color eggshells, but check this out. When we break open the eggs, it's the same on the inside, right? That's just like us. We have there's lots of people with lots of different skin colors, but on the inside, we're the same."
Mm-hmm. I think those are great lessons and great examples. I think too, it's really what you have both said about, starting the conversation, meeting the child where the child is, mm-hmm. and just being very sort of normal and natural about these conversations, and sort of what kind of media that they're exposed to and the people that they're exposed to, so that I think that it's not something other and mysterious, and something that you would hush about, like Dr. Taylor just said. But this is just everybody. Yes, we all have these differences, and that's what makes us all so special and unique, right? And you're both, I think you really nailed it. They are so much more complex and attuned to things than we give them credit for, right? We're gonna shift to some questions from our attendees, but first I wanted to ask you. We always ask our guests for some advice, or what is one thing you would have us do when we leave this call together? Chida, I'd ask you to start. What is what would you have us do?
Well, as I mentioned to you in our conversation, I get a lot of guidance from my faith wholeheartedly. I've always told my kids that they don't belong to me, they belong to God. I'm just the mother that God gave them. And so I always resort to remaining prayerful and asking God for discernment on how to navigate these children that He's given me, because He knows their future. And for whatever reason, He asked me to be their mother, and I am. So I would just ask that parents, if you have faith in God, ask God what to do with your kids. He knows, talk to him. I talk to him. And to also, before you start those conversations, make sure you're resolved in where you are in the whole situation. If you're uneasy, if you're unsure, you're going to project that on your children. But you have to know and be settled in your spirit and in your heart that whatever stance you're delivering to your children is one that you stand for. Hopefully it's a good one. But that, you believe it, because kids will look at you and kind of question. If you're not even really sure that you believe what you're saying, they're going to pick up on that, So whatever stuff that you have to work out in yourself, if you've been racist, if you've done some things, like, fix that, do a heart check, fix it before you start preaching to your children about the right things. So
That is such great advice. Get clear on where you are and get yourself straight before you talk to your children. Yeah. Dr. Taylor.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, right? We've got to model the behavior that we want kids to do, right? They're watching us, and even my 2-year-old just does everything that I do, mimics everything his brother does and his dad does, right? So we've really got to model the behavior we want them to see. I think I think it's so important to just show up and just do it, just talk about it, bring it up, and, like Chida said, in a way that works for them, and that you feel right about, right? And use those simple, concrete languages. And really, what that does is that helps set the foundation at whatever age you decide to talk to your kids about it. It sets the foundation for conversations in the future, right? So that if we start talking to them at 4 and 5 about melanin and maybe some unfairness in the world, then we already have that foundation to say, all right, now we can go a little bit deeper and tell me what you're experiencing and seeing, right? So I think doing that, because one of the reasons why is because that sets up the foundation for them to have real, deep, meaningful experiences with people who are different from them and have different backgrounds and experience the world differently. Because if you don't have any sense of what a person of color experiences and you're a white person, that's then the real relationships are going to be difficult, right? Real friendships are going to just fall apart. The second thing is I just want us to remember COVID, right? Like, COVID has been so difficult for us as parents. For me, I'll claim that, right? With not having daycare and having all of the emotion with grief and anxiety about even going to the grocery store, any little thing, it just like feels so anxious. Like, my kids are wanting to see their friends, they can't. And then systemic racism, right? These dual pandemics of systemic racism and COVID that we're dealing with. We as parents are not at the top of our game. We're not at our best, and that's okay. And to get okay with not being perfect, and even and just be accepting whatever we can be, and showing up that way and staying in it, even though even though it's hard and even though it may not be perfect. So give grace to yourself, give grace to others, like, take all those kid hugs that you can, to stay in the struggle, because especially with systemic racism, it's so important. We need to take anti-racist steps every day, take these daily actions so that we can make real change, right? And if we're all doing that, then things have to change. I have hope in that.
That was such great advice, Dr. Taylor. Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, we're going to shift to questions from our viewers. And the first one is from an educator who writes, I'm a humanities teacher, so I have had many discussions about the history of race and modern day issues, such as the politics of race and other newsworthy issues. In doing this, I use the terms Black, Mexican, Asian, and white. Are these terms inappropriate? I used to have students tell me that they thought saying African American seemed like I was trying too hard. I have gone with my gut and it has served me well, but I would like another perspective.
Who's answering that?
Do you want to start with that one?
Sure. You know what? That can be a tricky space to be in. I think people should educate themselves on what others want to be called. I think that's the first step. I remember being at a bridge program for college, and a kid was referencing an Asian person as an Oriental. And our teacher, who was Asian, was livid. Well, the kid didn't know that an Oriental thing was a thing, not a person. You don't call a person Oriental, you call them Asian, if you're unsure about the specifics. But he didn't know, so I think the first step is education. And if you encounter someone, if you are using the politically correct term and you encounter someone that's not okay with it, to ask them why. Like, why am I offending you? Or everything's in a conversation, and you're not going to please everybody. Even within the African American community, there's a dynamic between Africans at times and African Americans, and Africans don't want to be called African Americans, and so do you call them Black? Do you call them? You can't please everybody. Yeah, it's somewhere you're gonna mess up, I guarantee. But the first question is to ask, what should I call you, and what's happening right now? That's my undoctoral opinion about that. I don't know what Dr. Taylor has to say. So
I like
that's
that
my suggestion.
point about ask. And some of my Facebook friends were having this discussion, and a former colleague of mine, Greg, who's Black man, he's like, well, I would like you to call me Greg. And I thought, okay.
Yeah, no, I love that, Chida. I think that's so right on. And Elizabeth too, right? Like, we are individuals. We want to be seen as individuals. And at the same time, in this society that has racism in it, that is racist, right? That we need to realize that people are judged at the group level when they are a person of color, and in particular. And so there's a term that's, so I love your point, Chida, around ask folks what they want to be called, because it's different. And groups are not monolithic, right? Like, so everyone who identifies as African American or Black is not going to agree. And I love that Chida brought that point out. Everyone who, I hear the term Latinx a lot now, and especially activist anti-racist circles. So, and that relates to folks who are Hispanic, Latino, Latina, and the X piece of it is so Latinx, right? Is so that it doesn't have to be gendered. So whereas Latino is gendered for men, although it includes women too, and then Latina is for women. So Latinx has been an interesting term. With my partner being Native American, Apache, and now us actually living in Canada, with deep roots in San Diego, though. My mom lives there, went to college there. Jones is based there. But we're here in Canada now, and we have this conversation because in Canada, it's First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, right? And I was like, Adam, what do I say if I don't want to say a whole mouthful of things? And he said, well, oftentimes Indigenous is the more accepted term, and at the same time, it's not monolithic, right? There's lots of diversity of opinion. Some folks in the indigenous communities we've been in still say Indian country, right? And I think I never, as a white person, I don't say that. And that's, so you may hear that too. So there's a lot of complexity around terms. And I think the point is, like Chida said, ask the question, have the conversation, learn more.
That's great. Here's another question. What are your suggestions for parents who want to increase their family exposure to other ethnicities? Is it okay, for example, a white family living in an affluent area to go to a YMCA in another neighborhood where there are more opportunities to establish relationships with other kids and parents that don't look like them?
That's a great question. I think if the parents are transparent in their efforts, I mean, I don't see why anyone would oppose that. Because too, I think there's this indivisible divide in San Diego too. You have that whole north of the 8 and south of the 8, and in those situations. And even for me personally, my parents were very adamant about exposing me to all parts of San Diego County. But even as an adult, there have been times I've gone north of the 8 and didn't necessarily feel that comfortable in those parts of town, as recent as January. So, I think it's huge to introduce those conversations, go places that you normally haven't been before, maybe that are more diverse, and allow your kids to see you taking the lead in doing that, because it's a huge step. And then they won't have those big eyes when they see people that don't look like them, because they're used to seeing people that don't look like them. I think that's huge.
Yeah.
I wholeheartedly agree. If I could add. Definitely agree. And one of the most evidence-based ways to decrease prejudice is to increase contact, right? It's intergroup contact theory. So that when you have these groups and they're in contact or get exposure, have access to each other, that's what leads to lower prejudice and higher, helping behaviors, wanting to be friends, having more meaningful and significant relationships. And the conditions around this, right? Like the ways that contact or exposure is most powerful to decrease prejudice is when it's meaningful, frequent, and positive, right? So those three conditions, right? So yes, go to the YMCA and go often and talk to people and meet people and be friendly, and so that it's meaningful, positive, and frequent, right? However, this is a tough one, and I've heard this question a lot because a lot of our country, a lot of the U.S. is very segregated, and so there was recently a study that came out. So it's like when you can't have, or when you aren't able to make as much intentional outreach and make that exposure, what can you do? So a recent study came out. It was based out of Italy with elementary school students 9 and 10, and it showed that even imagined contact, so storytelling that included diverse groups of students, diverse groups of kids, when they had different magical powers working together, had higher, but did better at decreasing prejudice over 3 weeks, 1 hour session doing the storytelling with diverse groups together, working together over 3 weeks, 1 hour per week. And not only did it decrease prejudice, but it also increased helping behaviors. So tell stories, provide counter stereotypical examples. There's a few books that I really like to show to my kids, and I'll just mention 3. One is A for Activism, right? So it's an alphabet book, but it has kids of all colors, and it talks about protests, it talks about unions, it talks about LGBT rights. Like there's all these beautiful things. Then it's just, again, providing that foundation. Like, oh, later on, my son can ask me, what is LGBT? And we've talked about already kids that have 2 dads and 2 moms. And so exposing them to counter stereotypical examples, like, as soon as I could, I got the Black Panther action figure. I'm like, great, the movie's a little violent, but we can get the action figure. So whatever I can do to provide those things so they can imagine contact even.
I think that that's such a natural place to start conversations too, as with the children's books. So I think if you're feeling a little bit unsure of how to talk to kids, I think that is just a really nice, supportive way for parents to have those conversations. If you're reading books and the main characters are Black and brown kids, or they're written by Black and brown authors, it just, I think, is a really natural entry point, I think, for families. We have another question here, and looks like it is probably another educator. They thank you for being here, and I was wondering how you would recommend having a conversation with students who may not have the best role models at home without putting the student on defense or saying your parents are wrong. It's a tough one.
I guess I need a little more context. Are they, and I'm imagining they can't respond or immediately type back, but I think that's the challenge of being an educator is offering sometimes generalities and introducing concepts and topics and allowing children to process, but then saying, hey, if you want to talk about this further, if you have more questions, allowing that door to be open for further engagement without kind of dumping everything on them at one time. So I think it's safe to introduce concepts. That's what teachers do, allow them some time to process it. But also, if it's a general invitation that, if they say, hey, I'm here for you, if you have further questions, that if something gets back home and it comes off differently, it was said that the teacher did introduce the welcome students to come to them later on. But that's a tricky one. That would be my 2 cents to keep teaching. They're not going to like everything they hear, but yeah, it depends on what the topic is too and how it's introduced. But yeah, from what I could tell, that's what I would recommend.
And I like that invitation to engage more, either outside of class or at another time. I think that's a really great way to get at that. Dr. Taylor, what do you have to say about that one?
Yeah, and thank you for starting on that one, Chida. That's a hard one because, and it's come up a ton of times in these listening sessions that we've been having too. How do I engage with someone who says all lives matter? How do I balance out the fact that my family member is in the police and I'm outraged by the brutality I'm seeing from the police? Like, how do we stay in conversation and talk about these things when we come from different places and maybe have different ideas about it? And a lot of what we talked about with adults was, asking questions. And I think we can do this for kids too. To that point, Trida brought up about listening, right? So tell me why you think that. Help me understand where you're coming from. So, bringing up the topic, as Trida said, that's right. We got to just keep educating. Let's talk about the civil rights movement. Let's talk about redlining. Let's talk about whatever issue it is that's appropriate to bring up, and then tell me what you think about it, and we can and help me understand where you're coming from. And in that way, then you can look, if there's information you don't know, if they ask questions you don't know, then all right, let's come back to that. I'm not sure right now, but I want to come back and let's keep this conversation going so we can learn together.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Here's one. This is a family question. Let's see, my nieces, one is 4, the other is 11, are half Black, growing up with their white mother and grandparents in Texas. Their father has not been around in years. My sister and parents have decided not to address current events with them whatsoever. I have a good relationship with my nieces, and I want to support them during this time by giving them a safe space to explore the emotions they are feeling. I don't know how to explore what they know without talking about it, as if I was speaking with another adult. Do you have advice?
I'll let you take that one, Doctor.
Okay. I'll start first on this one. Yeah, I mean, I think thinking about my experience talking with my own very young biracial children, right? But I think it's so important to give them space to know all of who they are, right? And so I'm not sure that I'll come around to your question. I think that one thing I wanted to make sure to share is that for my sons, I want to make sure that they have an anti-racist, positive, white racial identity, right? So that it's not just a positive white racial identity, because that could lead to some scary things, but that the anti-racist piece is there, and that they feel happy in who they are, right? Of course, connected to their Indigenous heritage as well, and that's huge. Like, we go to powwows, and that's incredibly important. But it can be hard as a white person to develop an anti-racist, positive white racial identity. And so, thinking about the things that are positive about it, like, for example, my mom being from Ireland and singing to me every night before I went to bed to Laura, anytime I was hurt or in anger, anything, she could just wrap me in her arms and sing this song to me, and I would feel better. And her dad sang that to her as Bing Crosby, and in the song it says an Irish lullaby, right? And now I sing that to my sons, and my 4-year-old son will now sing that to my 2-year-old son, as to help him feel better when he's sad. And so I just think that's really sweet, and it's part of our culture, white culture, right? Because it was an Irish American song. So I think that piece is important to hold, like creating that positive identity. I think that creating also space for did you say I think she said African American, right? Black and white, right? Is so key too, and able to say, like, because there's so much complexity around biracial identity, because my kids won't be Indigenous enough for Indigenous communities, and they won't be white enough for white communities. They'll be, that's this constant feeling of I don't belong anywhere because I'm not enough of this or enough of that. And so being able to help them think about that, especially in the context of what's happening right now, like who am I? I'm biracial, but how am I perceived? Probably just as Black, depending on how light their skin is, right? So I just think starting those conversations and giving space for it is so critical. And like, what are you noticing? I maybe you're seeing the news, or how old are they? Did she say? Or how old is he?
4 and 11.
Okay, yeah. So the 4-year-old, I mean, that, probably not seeing the news. The 11-year-old with smartphones, I mean, it's almost like if you're a teenager or close to be a teenager, you just have to assume they're seeing this stuff because of the viral nature. Excuse me. So I'll pause there, Chida. I'd love to hear what you have to think too.
I think you nailed it. That's a tricky one. because it sounds like she recognizes the importance of needing to introduce a particular conversation to them, but having some barriers. I think relationship is so important in the sense that if you have a strong communicative relationship with someone, that the things that you need to talk about will come out when they need to come out. And so I would just recommend that she continue that line of communication with them. So when she needs to mention it, it doesn't sound weird. It's not abnormal. I think these conversations should be free flowing, as I mentioned earlier, and maybe just for her to take note of what's happening, maybe make some personal notes for herself. And it sounds like she may be taking the responsibility upon herself to kind of inform the girls or the kids on what they need to know, that she will be afforded those opportunities to mention those things, but just to keep the lines of communication open, maybe even saying things like, hey, you guys, if you're seeing things in the news that maybe you're unsettling and you feel like you don't have anybody to talk to, I'm here, little things like that. So a couple weeks later, if they see something like, hey, I remember you said I could talk to you. Well, this is my concern. So just letting them know she's there, I think, is the biggest thing she could do right now.
Right, just building that relationship and the trust in that relationship.
Yeah.
That question also reminded me of a theme that came up with both of you in conversation, and that was sort of the cultivating joy and resiliency in children around this topic, right? And is that something, could you touch on that, Chida and Dr. Taylor? What does that mean exactly to you?
It goes back to the whole notion of preserving their innocence and creating happy spaces for them. Even though we're all inundated with this, we don't have to torture them per se with what we're dealing with as well. I mean, there's only so much that they can contain. So I think what I was telling you when I asked my ex-husband how he was introducing the conversation, he said things were happening so quickly that he had to literally create a presentation for the boys to kind of roll out. And he's an English professor by trade, so he had to create this whole thing to introduce things. But they already watched the news together. They're already having these conversations. So when all this happened, it wasn't a new thing. But this particular weekend, he made sure to go out and do things with them. He and his wife were bowling with the kids. He told me they were outside playing marbles. So there was a balance of activities that they were doing. And then he would kind of interject things, through their weekend, or, hey, you guys, let's talk about something for a minute. But then he made sure to come back with some other, that wasn't the weight of the day, if you will. And so we have to find that balance. I think we have to find it for ourselves as adults. It's easy to get immersed in this, especially for me being in media. I just want to shut everything off. So sometimes you have to turn away from the TV and find your happy space too, because if you don't have one, you sure can't give one to your kids. So, yeah.
I think that's an important balance to strike, right? Is the realities of the injustices, but also celebrating what there, all of that there is to celebrate, right?
Yeah.
And, Dr. Taylor, you had said it so beautifully the other day. Can you talk a little bit more about that? The bringing joy into the conversation?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's so critical. And before I forget, I want to provide one more book that I think does this in a beautiful way, because I think storytelling is so important and all of that we've said. So B-Boy Buzz by Bell Hooks is a beautiful story about an African-American boy who's doing what he's doing and bouncing around and then having quiet time and just loving himself as a boy. And so reading that to my boys is an important way to bring in a joyful, resilient story. I think another piece that's so key is that when we're talking about issues of racism, it's really important to bring out allies, right? Even though it wasn't a majority of white people, how have white people been allies? How have people of color had resistance against it as well, right? That's that place of self-determination that's so critical in Indigenous communities, right? That we going from a deficit model of, oh, we're poor and we have this and all of these negative things to no, let's bring out our culture, let's revive our languages, let's have powwows and get in our regalia and do all of that and have some fun doing it. A story I wanted to tell as a white woman being partnered with an Indigenous man is the first time I went to a powwow. I was nervous because I'd never been. And I said to Adam, I was like, what are the rules? Like, what am I not supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? And one of the things I've learned from him is a huge principle among Indigenous folks is non-interference. So like even me asking him to tell me what to do, like he really wouldn't. So he only told me one thing. He's like, just don't go into the arena after it's blessed, right? Usually powwows take place in parks. It's big, beautiful area of grass, and he's like, just don't walk across or run across the arena after it's been blessed. I said, okay. But it turns out there's a lot more unspoken rules to powwows. And so Adam's dad they've been planning powwows for years in the LA area, Pasadena and Santa Fe Springs, and Adam's dad was the MC. And so he called out an intertribal, which means anyone can come and dance. And it was a round dance, so we're all standing shoulder to shoulder, moving together around a circle in the arena. And over the loudspeaker, so everyone at this powwow with 500 people could hear, Brian Adam's dad says, Aisha, you're doing it wrong. And so I throw my hands up and I'm like, oh gosh, I never, this is my first time at a powwow, whatever, laughed at it. He had said it in humor, and though it turns out I was doing it wrong. Like I didn't learn this for two or three more powwows, but I was doing the man's step, which is just a little bit different than the women's step. So I just think humor is such an important aspect of this work. Like we've got to stay light. We've got to have some levity. We've got to be able to laugh at ourselves, especially as white people learning about this stuff, and not take things so seriously. And so as I was able to laugh at it, then I was able to, but it stayed with me, right? That's a powerful experience. So then I was like, maybe I am doing it wrong. So I started looking and I started seeing what the women were doing versus what the men were doing. It's a very slight difference, but I learned through that. And so I think that's one way to find joy, is just to laugh about things a little bit, not, about things that have humor and that are light. I caution it though, because we don't want to laugh at pain, right? We want to make sure that there's trust there in order to laugh together.
And I think that goes back to when you opened with talking about getting in your heart space, right? That laughter is such a connection and such a way to open ourselves to each other, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
I'm afraid it's time for us to close. I want to thank our guests, Chida Rebecca and Aisha Taylor, for being with us today and providing us a lot to think about and to reflect on, and also some tools for talking to the children in our lives. Thank you both so much. I really appreciate your being with us today. And to everyone in attendance, thank you for joining us, and I wish you all well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.